We need to talk about anarchism, or the introduction to anarchism. This is the first video looking at this non-core ideology. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means, to be blunt, that it appears on paper 2 rather than paper 1. On paper 1 in Edexcel politics, you could be asked questions on socialism, liberalism, or conservatism, any two of them, or just 2 questions on one of them. But all 3 of those ideologies come from paper 1. This ideology comes from paper 2, and different schools and different teachers and different courses can actually do different ideologies. So there's anarchism, and there's feminism, and there's ecologism and nationalism, and you only have to do 1. So you know for a fact that there will definitely be 2 questions on anarchism, and you can answer that question. So you do not need to study more than 1 core ideology. You just choose the one you're going to study, you learn about it, and there will definitely be a question on it, which in some ways makes it easier than the other one, because in paper 1 you have to learn about 3 ideologies, and you know you're only going to get asked questions on 1 or 2 of them. Whereas here, you're definitely going to get some questions on it. So, but don't be confused when you go and you look at the paper and you're like, there's all this feminism and nationalism, all this kind of stuff here. You just find the one that you're going to answer on, which in this case, if I'm teaching you this year, is going to be anarchism, and you answer one of those 2 questions. Now, in this video, I'm just going to be talking about, in general, what anarchism is, some of the core principles, and introducing some of the topics that I'll be looking at in future videos and discussions. So here we are. Here go the tiny little cocks in the corner. Why did anarchism happen? Okay, so anarchism is different to the other ideologies, and I'll tell you some of my thinking here about why we're doing anarchism as our non-core ideology. The reason why I think this is an interesting comparison is because all 3 of the ideologies we've looked at so far have very different views about what the state and the government should be, what their role should be, and what they should be doing. So, for example, if we look at liberalism is kind of starts off by saying, well, the state shouldn't be an hereditary monarch. It shouldn't be some sort of kind of like religious figure. We should have some sort of kind of democracy, power to the people, and all that, and the state should kind of be as small as possible. And then modern liberals come along and they kind of say, well, hang on a minute, no, maybe the state needs to do a bit more. It needs to be like an enabling state, rather than your night watchman, where it's doing as little as possible other than securing property. We should be enabling people to compete in this meritocracy. And then, of course, the reaction against that, you've got conservatism, which has a more negative view on human nature, which kind of argues, no, we need an authoritarian state that will keep stability, that will keep tradition, that will change to conserve when necessary, but will also kind of have this natural hierarchy, whether you can call it a ruling class or whatever you want. And then, of course, you get other conservatives, that then, the neo-right in particular, that then says, hang on, the state should, again, be as small as possible, and it should enforce kind of like traditional values, but at the same time, it should allow the economy to kind of run free, even to the point, perhaps, of rejecting Keynesian economics and things like that. And then, of course, you get socialism, which comes along and says, no, we need a huge state. We need to nationalize huge amount of industries and trains and education and health and all those things. And the state needs to be run by us. The state needs to be the people, the working class, and the state needs to be part of our kind of collective identity. So you've got kind of 3 different views there, or maybe even 5 different views, or 8 different views, depending on how many kind of sub-ideologies you want to look at. Should the state be small? Should the state be enabling? Should the state be authoritarian and protective? Should the state be part of our kind of collective identity? Should everything be run by the state? And then anarchists start to come along and say, but maybe it's actually the state itself that is the problem. Maybe it's got nothing to do with human nature, which is perhaps what some of the other ones would argue. Maybe the problem isn't capitalism, which is perhaps what socialists might argue. Maybe the problem is that we are being forced to live under the rule of something else. And that is what is causing societal problems. So anarchists write at a variety of periods of time But the common thread between them is that they argue that the state, the government, is wrong, and it denies your natural freedoms. Now, this is quite, to our kind of modern ears, quite an extreme view, because there are no countries in the world that have no government, have no state. And so it's very hard for us to even, if socialism was hard for us to visualize, and communism was hard for us to visualize, in the way Marx saw it, then this is even harder for us to visualize, because it's so alien, so different to what we see in our modern Western society. But of course, that doesn't mean that it's wrong. We just need to kind of work harder to try and understand what these thinkers are saying and to really kind of judge them on their own terms. Like, just because we can't see how it would work doesn't mean that it wouldn't work. It just means we need to kind of work harder to try and get into their heads and really kind of understand them. So the other thing to say before we get to looking at the core values is that the word anarchism and the word anarchy often has an emotional connection and a judgment attached to it, and it's often used negatively. Like, sometimes your teacher or your parents might kind of walk in and be like, "Oh, it's absolute anarchy in here," or someone might see something going, chaos somewhere and be kind of like, "Oh, this is anarchism." And people often use anarchism or anarchist as a synonym for chaos, or as a synonym for things going kind of horribly wrong, or being messy. And that, you can use words however you like, but that is not how the original anarchists and how the anarchist thinkers are describing anarchy. And in fact, quite the opposite. They actually believe in very ordered, calm societies, but ones that come about naturally rather than through the state. So what we need to do just at the very beginning, before we talk about anarchism, is we need to kind of put the use of the word anarchism, or the common use of the word anarchism and the common use of the word anarchy, to one side and be like, this isn't an ideology about chaos, although you might come to that conclusion at the end of it. It is an ideology that argues that society can run itself without a state. So what are the core ideas of anarchism? Now, I'll just kind of preview ahead a little bit here that anarchism has two main threads. And in fact, if I just skip ahead, I'll show you this here. But we have two huge groupings within anarchism, and we're going to call them collectivist anarchists and we're going to call them individualist anarchists. And they have very little in common, I would kind of argue, but we are going to start with what they do have in common. But you're going to find out that they are anarchists and there are anarchists, and there are very, very different ideas. Some of them feel a lot more like a kind of extreme version of socialism. Some of them feel a lot more like a kind of an extreme version of liberalism, and there feels like a big gap between them. But it's going to be important for us then to try and start off with what these two very disparate groups actually have in common and where they would start as a starting point before they diverge. But I wanted to kind of bring that out because I think anarchism, some people find learning about anarchism quite tricky. And I think it's easier if you start off with a principle of kind of going, right, there are essentially two big types of anarchist, which don't actually have a lot in common. So in a sense, we're going to be learning about two ideologies here, almost like anarchism collective, anarchism individualist. So get your head kind of in that state. But we're going to start off by kind of saying, well, what do these two very different groups have at their core? And the first obvious one is there is no state. There is no government. There is no over kind of bearing ruler. And therefore there's going to be no kind of elections to kind of a national government, although local little groups may have their own kind of procedures for how things are done. But you cannot be ruled, you cannot be controlled, you cannot be told to do things because it's for the good of the state. This is a no state zone. And the idea behind this is that it will utterly and completely give you personal liberty. Because if you think about liberalism, it still has a state. It basically says we want to give you as much freedom as possible. Freedom is good, but we definitely need a state to protect your rights and to protect your property. And And I might have my wrong thinker here, but is it John Locke or John Mill that talks about you kind of sacrifice liberty for safety? It's that social contract idea. Anarchists kind of get to the same argument and say, no, we should not have to give up personal liberty for any reason. So they almost start from the same point as the liberals here. But instead of jumping right and saying, okay, so we are going to need a state for these small things, they jump left and say, we can do this without the state, because freedom is more important than, or protecting freedom is more important than the benefits of having the state, or having the state will cause more problems than actually not having it there in the first place. And this next one is a really, really important point to understanding anarchism, because I'm sure many of you will already be thinking, and I hope you're thinking, looking at this idea of no state and thinking about this idea about personal liberty, and be kind of going, well then what happens when people misbehave? What happens when people commit crimes? What happens if people try to hurt one another? How would you organize the basics in society, like water and electricity and driving licenses, and I hope your minds are already kind of going, but how would it work without a state? How would we interact with one another? Where would the boundaries be? And these are all brilliant questions when discussing and challenging anarchism. But the answer from an anarchist is this, which is that if you take away the state and if you take away these kind of outside influences, there will still be order. There will just be natural order. And they argue that human nature, and anarchists actually have a very positive view of human nature, does not need these external controls. And if you were to, it's a bit like if you imagine I was to get a glass of water and kind of shake it up, so it's all kind of wibbling around in the glass, and then I kind of put it down. Over time, the water will then find its own natural level and will stay. And anarchists will argue that human nature and natural order is the same. It's that you take away the state and you will still have order. And a lot of anarchists use nature, examples from the animal kingdom, to show that a beehive doesn't have a government, that has a queen, I suppose. Maybe that's a bad example, but there are no governments in the animal kingdom, and yet they still are ordered. There is still not chaos. And crucially, in the animal kingdom, you also don't get these kind of like oppressive, poverty-ridden kind of communities. And I'm just kind of thinking here and go, is there equality in the animal kingdom? Probably not. And I hope you're doing the same thing. Please don't accept anything I say in any of these videos or any ideology as necessarily true. You can challenge in your mind what I'm saying, but I'm trying to present the argument that kind of comes from the anarchist, that there can be order without it being enforced from the top. And one argument that people sometimes give here, and I hope I'm probably over explaining some of these ideas, but I think it's important to kind of make this point, is that sometimes students say to me, yes, but if you didn't have the government, what is stopping us from killing each other and stealing things from each other? To which I think there's a very important and perhaps slightly worrying response is, if you think the only reason that you haven't stabbed the person next to you in the face is because you might get in trouble, then you've got serious problems and you should sort them out. Most of the time, 99.9999999% of the time, the reason we don't stab the person next to us in the face is because we don't want to. It's because we are empathetic. It's because we are kind. It's because we morally believe it is the wrong thing to do. It's because other people in the room would stop us. I think sometimes people feel they are under a lot more control from the state than they actually are. And actually, most of our social interactions, and even business interactions and professional interactions, are governed by natural order, by society simply kind of finding its own way of interaction without these kind of opposing forces. Now, this, of course, then leads to complete economic freedom, because if there isn't a state to do like Keynesian style economics or socialist style public ownership, then there is economic freedom. But what happens in that economic freedom is then interesting, because there's these two types of anarchism, which we will be covering in more detail in the future videos. And actually, anarchists kind of differ here about what this economic freedom would mean. Some of them say that with economic freedom, you would actually get a lot more communal ownership, living in communities, a bit like socialism max. Whereas other anarchists argue that we'd kind of go towards Adam Smith style free markets, laissez-faire style max. So there's a disagreement here about what economic freedom would mean, but the agreement is that there is no interference in the economy by any kind of state or overarching institution. But what would then happen? But one of the, and this is the final core value I'm going to talk about before I just kind of overview the two main types. One of the things that I think anarchism is both a strength and a weakness of anarchism is it is utopian. And utopian kind of means like paradise, nirvana. A utopian society is a perfect society. And in many ways, all of the ideologies we've looked at, especially socialism and liberalism, argue that if only we had freedom, we would have utopia. If only we had socialism, we would have utopia. If only we had communism, we would have utopia. You know, they're kind of aiming towards this kind of perfection end goal. Conservatism is a bit different. But anarchism really has this idea, you know, that it has this beautiful idea that if only you took away the state and you freed people, natural order would happen, and there would be a much more supportive, kind, successful society just waiting for us if we kind of removed the state. And I think it's important when you look at anarchism to have this idea in mind that it is utopian. There are going to be things that you're going to learn about in this unit that you kind of go, wow, you know, that sounds lovely, but it's not going to happen. And that comes down to your own kind of personal political viewpoints. You may well read these thinkers and kind of go, my goodness, this sounds lovely, let's make this happen. But I think it's important to kind of acknowledge that this ideology does stretch the realms of perhaps plausibility. Not necessarily to the point where it's impossible, but it is going to feel like a reach at certain points. But perhaps they're reaching for a goal which is actually better than all of the other possible ideologies. Let's not shoot it down, but let's just understand that this is going to be an ideology which is going to be very utopian. So what are these two main types? And this is the last thing I will talk about in this video. So you should already understand that anarchism is an ideology which argues there should be no state, that argues that we will find a natural order. But you should also understand from what I've told you that there are these two big types of anarchism, which, other than the core values I've discussed, have very little in common. And the first set of types that we're going to be looking at in future videos and future lectures is called collectivist anarchism. And there's three types that we're going to be kind of touching on, which is anarcho-communism, mutualism, and anarcho-syndicalism. And what these three have in common is that they all kind of believe that human beings, when given ultimate freedom, will group together into communes or small groups. They disagree slightly about how these small groups might occur. You know, are they based on occupation? Are they based on location? Are they based on shared values? Are they, you know, how do these kind of groupings occur? But all of these guys, what all these guys have in common is that they argue if you take the state away, people will group up to support one another, to work together towards common goals. And that's why earlier I kind of called this like socialism max. It's the idea, if you think about the human nature values of socialism, that is what these guys believe in to the next level. This idea of collectivism, cooperation, fraternity, and they believe that communities would work together to provide for everyone's needs, and that people would be free to move between these communities if they wished, and different communities would support different styles of people and so on. But this is the first type that we will be studying. The second type is a little bit more complex, and we have two main types here, which is AnarchoCapitalism and Egoism. But this type takes the ideas of liberalism and individualism to the max, and argues that without the state we will be far more competitive with one another. And this could either lead to a kind of extreme version of laissez-faire style capitalism, or could lead to a society, which is egoism, where people are far more self-interested and only kind of really focus on benefiting themselves. Now, you may well, and hopefully you are, picking up threads of Ayn Rand and Robert Nozick from the New Right here, because in many ways some of these ideas are next level neo-liberalism. And we'll be kind of talking about that. But hopefully you can see here just how different these two types are. You know, on one side, we've got anarchists kind of saying, take away the state, and we'll live in these kind of groups. We're going to be very supportive. And then we've got these other anarchists that are kind of saying, take away the state, and we will have this kind of wonderful capitalist society with no outside kind of interference. You know, these are two very, very different visions of what an anarchist society would be. And in many ways, they both argue that this is the natural order, which is what perhaps is one of the kind of interesting kind of things that you could kind of think about is, if you took the state away, what do you think would happen? You know, which of these two are the most likely outcome of taking the state away? You know, would people group up and work together, or under a kind of collective human nature, or would people move more towards an individualist scenario? Now, my guess is most of you would kind of think this, but maybe that's only because we live in a capitalist society. Maybe, I don't know, but there's our kind of opening thoughts on to anarchism. So I suggest what you do now is you go and read the kind of introduction, whichever textbook you're using. You kind of go read the introduction, the first couple of pages, look at some of the core ideas, maybe have a little look at some of the key thinkers that are kind of coming up. But I would suggest the most important thing you could do is have a think about what your initial response is to anarchism. Build up a wall before you knock it down. You know, try and, you know, if you're feeling quite negative about this, then kind of think, well, what are the benefits of this? What are the strengths of this? What are the positive aspirations here? And then kind of think, well, what are my concerns? What isn't going to work? Where am I skeptical of this? Thank you for watching the video. If you liked it, then don't forget to like it, subscribe to the channel, and I do hope you'll be back to see these two ideas in more detail as the next videos come out. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.